weapons. Russia's conventional and nuclear arsenal is a small piece of what it was during the Cold War, yet the country is pursuing a new class of air-independent submarines, a T-50 stealth fighter jet, next-generation missiles and high-tech gear for individual ground soldiers. The National Interest has recently published a number of reports about the technological progress now being made by Russian military developers. The various write-ups include reporting on new Russian anti-satellite weapons, T-14 armored tanks, air defenses and early plans for a hypersonic, 6th generation fighter jet, among other things. Russia is unambiguously emphasizing military modernization and making substantial progress, the reports from the National Interest and other outlets indicate. For instance, Russia has apparently conducted a successful test launch of its Nudol direct ascent anti-satellite missile, according to the National Interest. This is the second test of the new weapon, which is capable of destroying satellites in space. The weapon was apparently launched from the Plesetsk test launch facility north of Moscow, the report from the National Interest writes. In addition, the National Interest's Dave Majumdar reported that Russian airborne forces plan 6 armored companies equipped with newly modified D-72B3M tanks. Over the next 2 years, those 6 companies will be expanded to battalion strength, the report states. Russia is also reportedly developing a so-called Terminator 3 inches tank support fighting vehicle. During the Cold War, the Russian defense budget amounted to nearly half of the country's overall expenditures. Now, the country's military spending draws upon a smaller percentage of its national expenditure. However, despite these huge percentage differences compared to the 1980s, the Russian defense budget is climbing again. From 2006 to 2009, the Russian defense budget jumped from $25 billion up to $50 billion according to Business Insider, and the 2013 defense budget is listed elsewhere at $90 billion. The Russian military had roughly 766,000 active frontline personnel in 2013 and as many as 2.4 million reserve forces, according to GlobalFirepower.com. During the Cold War, the Russian army had as many as 3 to 4 million members. By the same 2013 assessment, the Russian military is listed as having more than 3,000 aircraft and 973 helicopters. On the ground, GlobalFirepower.com says Russia has 15,000 tanks, 27,000 armored fighting vehicles and nearly 6,000 self-propelled guns for artillery. While the Russian military may not have a conventional force the sheer size of its Cold War force, they have made efforts to both modernize and maintain portions of their mechanized weaponry and platforms. The Russian T-72 tank, for example, has been upgraded numerous times since its initial construction in the 1970s. On the overall naval front, GlobalFirepower.com assesses the Russian Navy as having 352 ships, including 1 aircraft carrier, 13 destroyers and 63 submarines. The Black Sea is a strategically significant area for Russia in terms of economic and geopolitical considerations as it helps ensure access to the Mediterranean. Analysts have also said that the Russian military made huge amounts of conventional and nuclear weapons in the 80s, ranging from rockets and cruise missiles to very effective air defenses. In fact, the Russian-built S-300 and S-400 anti-aircraft air defenses, if maintained and modernized, are said to be particularly effective, experts have said. Citing Russian news report, the National Interest reported that the Russians are now testing a new S-500 air defense systems able to reportedly reach targets up to 125 miles. In the air, the Russians have maintained their 1980s-built Su-27 fighter jets, which have been postured throughout strategic areas by the Russian military. Often compared to the U.S. Air Force's F-15 Eagle fighter, the Su-27 is a maneuverable twin-engine fighter built in the 1980s and primarily configured for air superiority missions. RAND Wargame, while many experts maintain that NATO's size, firepower, Air supremacy and technology would ultimately prevail in a substantial engagement with Russia. That does not necessarily negate findings from a RAND study released last year explaining that NATO would be put in a terrible predicament should Russia invade the Baltic states. NATO force structure in Eastern Europe in recent years would be unable to withstand a Russian invasion into neighboring Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, the RAND study has concluded. After conducting an exhaustive series of wargames wherein red, Russian, and blue, NATO, forces engaged in a wide range of war scenarios over the Baltic states, a RAND Corporation study called Reinforcing Deterrence on NATO's Eastern Flank determined that a successful NATO defense of the region would require a much larger air-ground force than what is currently deployed. In particular, the study calls for a NATO strategy similar to the Cold War era's air-land battle doctrine from the 1980s. During this time, the US Army stationed at least several 100,000 troops in Europe as a strategy to deter a potential Russian invasion. Officials with US Army Europe tell Scout Warrior that there are currently 30,000 US Army soldiers in Europe. The RAND study maintains that, without a deterrent the size of at least 7 brigades, fires and air support protecting Eastern Europe, that Russia could overrun the Baltic states as quickly as in 60 hours. As currently postured, NATO cannot successfully defend the territory of its most exposed members. Across multiple games using a wide range of expert participants in and out of uniform playing both sides, the longest it has taken Russian forces to reach the outskirts of the Estonian and or Latvian capitals of Tallinn and Riga, respectively, is 60 hours. Such a rapid defeat would leave NATO with a limited number of options, the study writes. Air-land battle was a strategic warfighting concept followed by US and Allied forces during the Cold War which, among other things, relied upon precise coordination between a large maneuvering mechanized ground force and attack aircraft overhead. As part of the approach, air attacks would seek to weaken enemy assets supporting frontline enemy troops by bombing supply elements in the rear. As part of the air-ground integration, large conventional ground forces could then more easily advance through defended enemy frontline areas. A rapid assault on the Baltic region would leave NATO with few attractive options, including a massive risky counterattack, threatening a nuclear weapons option or simply allowing the Russian to annex the countries. One of the limited options cited in the study could include taking huge amounts of time to mobilize and deploy a massive counterattack force which would likely result in a drawn-out, deadly battle. Another possibility would be to threaten a nuclear option, a scenario which seems unlikely if not completely unrealistic in light of the US strategy to decrease nuclear arsenals and discourage the prospect of using nuclear weapons, the study finds. A third and final option, the report mentions, would simply be to concede the Baltic states and immerse the alliance into a much more intense Cold War posture. Such an option would naturally not be welcomed by many of the residents of these states and would, without question, leave the NATO alliance weakened if not partially fractured. The study spells out exactly what its wargames determined would be necessary as a credible, effective deterrent. Gaming indicates that a force of about 7 brigades, including 3 heavy armored brigades, adequately supported by air power, land-based fires, and other enablers on the ground and ready to fight at the onset of hostilities, could suffice to prevent the rapid overrun of the Baltic states, the study writes. During the various scenarios